Welcome to History Today. It's a podcast-style discussion of the way history makes its way into our daily lives. Now, typically I have a guest, but today I'm going to be flying solo, and I wanted to discuss The First King, an Italian film directed by Matteo Rovere, which depicts the legendary founding of Rome. Here's a synopsis I found on filmitalia.org. Quote, "The First King, a tale with no narrative precedents, brings the viewer to an unknown world where the forces of nature and primitive humanity intertwine with the beliefs and superstitions that ruled life at the time. In the 8th century BC, the area spanning the banks of the Tiber and the hills of Lazio are occupied only by rudimentary villages. This is a wild world open to exploration and conquest, and one day will witness the founding of Rome. Here, everybody fights to survive, and the universe of beliefs, mysticism, and religion is the only means for men to understand the world. Men are victims of nature and violence. Our characters move in this world, fighting for their life and fanning the flame of a dream that is bigger than them, a dream of glory and destruction. To become king, the first king, Romulus must annihilate what is most dear to him, his twin brother Remus. I'm really excited about the setting, as far as I know, this is really the first time anyone has tried to portray the era on the big screen. Luckily, the filmmakers are passionate about the project and reportedly had an $8 million budget to pursue their vision. I'm pretty impressed by their efforts and thus far find it really cool that they actually made their whole cast speak a reconstructed, what they're describing as Proto-Italic language. And from an article I read, they said this was possible thanks to a group of semiologists using epigraphs, tombs, and objects that were contemporary to the time period in which Romulus and Remus were imagined to have lived. The film had a quite limited release, and it's actually only thanks to one of you guys that I even heard about it. Thus far, though, it seems to be getting pretty good reviews, and I can see that it's hovering about a 7 or 8 on IMDb. If anyone knows where I can find it, either online or in the US, please let me know, as I'd love to watch the movie and report back on my impressions. But for now, I wanted to open up the discussion to talk more about the history behind the film's chosen topic. So let's get started. Let's start with the very premise of the movie, which is captured by the title, The First King. So what's the history behind this? Well, according to traditional Roman history, the first king of Rome was Romulus. The story goes that he and his twin brother Remus were born to a Vestal virgin from Alba Longa named Ray Silvia. When King Amulius discovered that she had betrayed her vows of celibacy, he ordered that she be imprisoned and her sons killed by the elements. The two twins were thus abandoned in the wild. However, they were found and saved by a she-wolf, who cycled them back to health. Eventually, the babies were discovered by a shepherd and his wife, who raised them. The boys then grew up to be shepherds, working in the countryside of Latium. One day, they fell into a quarrel with shepherds from the neighboring town of Alba Longa, the town in which they were born but didn't really have a recollection of. Remus was taken captive by King Amulius, who did not recognize the twins. Romulus rallied a band of locals to help him save his brother, and in the process, they actually killed the ruler. The town offered them the crown, which they refused, choosing instead to found their own city nearby. The brothers then searched for a new home but disagreed on location. Romulus wished to found it atop the Palatine Hill, while Remus preferred the Aventine Hill. To settle the dispute, they agreed to observe the birds and determine the favor of the gods. Remus would be the first to observe a set of birds, counting 6 in total, while his brother would eventually count a total of 12. However, the two remained at a deadlock. Remus claimed victory by precedence, and Romulus claimed victory by magnitude. They continued to quarrel. Romulus set about fortifying the Palatine with trenches and a wall. Remus mockingly jumped over the feeble constructions. In anger, Romulus killed his brother, declaring, quote, "So perish every one that shall hereafter leap over my wall," end quote. The date, April 21st, 753 BC, would mark the founding of Rome, at least in the traditional narrative. So where did this story come from? Well, the oldest version of the tale we know dates back to an account written by Quintus Fabius Pictor of the 3rd century BC. Though his original work is lost to us, we have many later authors quoting it. As for what prompted the author to write the story initially, we don't really know. He was writing at a time when Rome was just gaining control of Italy and facing off against older, more established powers of the Mediterranean. This must have put pressure on Rome to shore up its own backstory and explain how it came to be. It's likely that in doing so, any written records would most likely have drawn from popular oral traditions passed down over the generations. Perhaps there were even older records to refer to, or maybe these had once existed but were destroyed when Rome was sacked by barbarians. We don't really know, although from the digging I've found, people actually seem to think that the sacking of Rome didn't really affect the archives, so it's kind of a confused mess, but it's possible some of these were destroyed. In any case, All of this time period is clouded in a lot of mystery and myth. But over the years, this initial tale would be added to and modified. Today, we have about 25 different versions of this creation myth that we can access. One of the prime alternate versions told that the Romans were instead descended from wandering Trojans after their defeat by the Greeks. This tale appears to have been in circulation as early as the 5th century, and Virgil would famously add to the mythology by reconciling these two foundation tales. He would do so formally in his epic The Aeneid by tying the ancestry of Romulus to the wandering Trojan prince Aeneas. This formal adoption of events was done at the request of Emperor Augustus, who wished to tie his own ancestry to these legendary founders, thus legitimizing his own rule. This new narrative also served to bolster Rome's own historical credentials, which were otherwise quite crude when compared to the stories of the Greeks whom they culturally admired. So what do historians make of this story? Well, as with many foundation myths, it's a case of trying to sort fact from fiction. The convoluted and fantastical details are easy enough to dismiss, as is pointed out by even our ancient authors. Some of the larger sweeping narrative points, however, are harder to dismiss, and many hold some foundational bases. We will touch on these in a little bit. For now, I want to briefly address the murky nature of this period. It's commonly understood today that records of Rome's early monarchs were mostly legendary. Most scholars believe that their stories were created over time to provide simple explanations for how things came to be. Who founded Rome? Romulus. Who created the government and the army structure? Romulus. Who codified the laws? Romulus. Each additional ancient king was thus burdened with a piece of Rome's forgotten history. Numa Pompilius, for example, the second king, is attributed with the development of Roman religion, its traditions, its rituals, and its temples. Only when we get to the reigns of later Roman kings do we have a reason to rank things as more fiction than fantasy. Yet even then, these assessments are held only tentatively. So what do we think really happened? Well, if you want a good rundown of Rome's early history, I cover part of it in my video on the rise of Rome, which talks you through the founding of the city to its conquest of the Italian peninsula. You can also check out the first few episodes of Mike Duncan's podcast for more context, or check out the description where I've listed some good sources. But anyways, to recap things, we know that ancient Italy was filled with many different communities who made a home in all sorts of environments. Some by the coast were merchants, by the rivers were fishermen, by the plains were farmers, and by the hills were pastoralists. Archaeologists examining the region of Latium have confirmed the presence of Bronze Age communities living in the area as early as the 14th century BC. Rome would have been founded at some point by one of these groups. In fact, if you take a look at some of the burial records, it seems that there were actually a variety of different groups that made their home at Rome. The reason for this is that its site was actually quite coveted, and it was protected by hills, had a nearby river, and had passing trade routes. Evidence suggests that relatively early on, small villages began to pop up on the hills along the Tiber. Relatively recent archaeology has actually uncovered a wall on the northern side of the Palatine, dated to the 9th century BC. This find predates the traditional founding of Rome by at least a century, but does seem to confirm key ideas that the first settlement was built atop the Palatine and that it included a wall. Interestingly enough, other aspects from the story also manifest in reality. These were preserved by the Romans themselves and lasted into the era of the emperors. For instance, one could actually visit the cave in which Romulus and Remus were said to have been cared for by the wolf, the house in which they supposedly lived, and the temple of Jupiter Stator, where Romulus is said to have prayed before his battle with the Sabines. Fact or fiction, I find these details fascinating. In any case, this first settlement, once established, would grow. According to legend, the early city of Rome grew larger when Romulus invited men from all nations to join his people. Where a polite invitation failed, force was used, as is the case with the story of the abducted and raped Sabine women. If we generalize these ideas, they do hold some merit. For instance, we know that Rome did indeed expand through the joining of communities. At first, this would have occurred amongst the villages situated atop the various hills along the Tiber. Over the centuries, these then expanded outwards, conquering and assimilating or allying with their neighbors. The communities named with the legends were also real. The Sabines, for instance, were in fact a tribe which squabbled routinely with the Romans, while the city of Alba Longa was also real, and a place which at some point is believed to have headed up the Latin League before the Romans took over. But evidence of these locations should not necessarily confirm the legends, any more than the presence of a historical Troy confirms the events of the Iliad. I look forward to seeing how the film treats the subject matter, and hope that you enjoyed this discussion for the time being. If you'd like to see more of this sort of historical commentary on modern media, please let me know, as it was a blast to research and present. Anyways, I've been rambling long enough. See you next time, and definitely, if you have a link to where I can find this film, let me know, as I'd love to do a review. Anyways, see you in the next one. Bye-bye.